The topic of our talk this morning is You Don't Stand a Ghost of a Chance. It's a hard talk to do, especially since I have notes that are twice as long as normal. So we're just going to have to stop somewhere or race and cut or do something like that. This is the last in one of those little sub-series. And in this sub-series, we've been discussing sensitivity. We've been discussing degrees of clairvoyance. And last time, we were speaking more about the insight side of things, where one has intuitions of truth, which, when fit inside of clairvoyance, make for spiritual sight. We were talking about a method or a means of determining what is true. You could call it a spiritual theory of knowledge, or if you really wanted to get fancy and tell your friends that you listened to a talk on spiritual epistemology, you could have done that. We began this little sub-series by talking about sensitivity. We noted that a normal person is firmly incarnated into the physical body. The senses are strong, and the person is relatively insensitive. Healthy and alert in the world, but insensitive to the spiritual realms. We also noted that if the etheric body was firmly attached to the physical and firmly inside of it, then that person wouldn't even be interested in something like this. They would think it is the stuff of dreamers. However, when one is not firmly attached to the physical, then you have the personality of a sensitive. Someone who is aware of inner realities because they can detach their attention from this realm and put it into the other realms. Now, sensitivity is not a virtue. And in most cases, it's not a talent. And it's not a gift, as some people think. It's merely a somatic state. It's a state of the different bodies. We were very specific when we talked about that, and we said that the loose connection was between the physical and the etheric bodies because that's the usual kind of sensitivity. We said that there were two major kinds of sensitivity, one being an involutionary sensitivity, where someone has not come into the world fully yet and mastered this world and done things with this world to go through it. Some people actually refuse to come fully into the body because they're afraid they're going to lose their spiritual sensitivity. And that's the very issue. We need to lose that spiritual sensitivity of that kind because we're not in control. That's the spiritual sensitivity that animals have and beings that are not fully evolved. We said the other major kind of sensitivity was an evolutionary sensitivity where someone had gone through the major lessons of this world and progressed just fine through them, and then found that this world was not enough, that something more was needed, that one needed to go beyond into realms where there was more meaning. We could have been more accurate yet, and we could have said that there are other kinds of etheric sensitivity, and we could have even gone so far as to say that there are sensitivities where higher vehicles become detached. And when those higher vehicles become attached, one is capable of being sensitive and working on much higher planes. Usually that's the property of very highly spiritually developed people. Sometimes it's the case that some people detach even higher vehicles in an involuntary way when we're dealing with different kinds of insanity. But we won't get into that. Sensitivity can be cultivated but it is usually not wise to do so. It is best that sensitivity is a byproduct, and that it is a byproduct of control and character development. Because if one just develops sensitivity, that's all one has, and one gets into trouble with that. Usually, there is a triad or a triangle of talents that one wants to keep in balance if one wants to unfold spiritually. One vertex of the triangle is sensitivity. Another vertex is knowledge, and a third vertex is will. If you have a balance between will, sensitivity, and knowledge, you can make a great deal of spiritual progress. What happens is that most people are highly sensitive, and they have all kinds of knowledge, but they don't have the will to do anything about it. Will is something that is pretty hard to come by, and most people don't put in the effort to develop it. Now, in looking at sensitivity and clairvoyance, as we have been looking at them for the past 5 talks, we haven't been comprehensive. We have mentioned some things like hereditary clairvoyance, as found in gypsies and Highlanders, and we've mentioned a few things like that, but there are other varieties of involuntary clairvoyance that are produced in different ways. Now, in looking over these talks, I think I have perhaps erred in emphasis by being overly precautionary. And the reason for that is for the last 30-some years, I've been doing a lot of counseling. And I've encountered a lot of people that have opened up all kinds of clairvoyance, many different kinds. And because it isn't the kind that is at their control, many of them had deep psychological problems. Many of them were bothered by entities and things like that. And I'm just really careful about people getting into these things and not knowing how sensitive the issue is, how critical self-control is, and especially how important it is to be of a positive, strong, loving, moral character. So I think I'm going to continue to be cautious today, but I have to make a few statements every now and then just to make sure that we don't get off balance. As long as one is doing one's part in the divine evolution, in the creation, that is participating in the ongoing work, maybe not in the way that the world goes about it, but even the world is growing in the spiritual process. And as long as one works from the highest, most altruistic values and is cultivating unselfishness and is serving others, and as long as one proceeds carefully and remains in control of self, there's no reason to not unfold higher faculties and capacities. It's admirable, it's desirable, and in many ways it's our evolutionary responsibility. We're just like children in a way. We're growing up. We're becoming better, and we're learning new things. And unfolding spiritual vision is among them. If we had a blind person, and that blind person had the capacity by taking effort to learn to see and chose not to, we wouldn't regard that person very highly, because we know that person would be missing. By missing all of the things of the shapes of forms and light and color and all of those things, the person would be missing a good deal. The only difference between the blind person and our blindness to the spiritual worlds is the magnitude of the effort that has to be put forth. No individual that has developed clairvoyance by their own efforts has ever said it was easy. No person who's ever developed it has said it wasn't worthwhile. Everybody has found it is a world of wonders. It's something that keeps one in awe. Max Heindel said that clairvoyance, or having clairvoyance, one has a tool that's more powerful than the microscope and the telescope put together. The computer hadn't been developed in his time, but if it had been, he probably would have included that as well, because you can get to exactly what you need. Once an individual has the ability to see, they can dig out any secret of any individual that they wish. No wonder a person has to have high ethics. I think we've all had it happen where we have shared something with a friend that was of a very intimate nature and asked confidence, and then a few months later a spat comes up and the friend throws it back in our face and it really hurts. And that's the kind of thing that we would have with each and every individual into whose life we looked with clairvoyance. Nobody has ever said that unfolding it is easy. It requires painstaking effort to develop that control because the spiritual worlds are very elusive. Anytime we try to concentrate, it's just easy to see how our consciousness is pilfered away from us. We get interested in something other than what we're concentrating on, and before we know it, we have slipped away. And this is a gross example. Clairvoyance is much, much more elusive than that. It's also much more subtle. And it requires extreme subtlety on our part. But we can do it. If we can learn other things in life, there's no reason we can't develop the knack for clairvoyance. If we think about the amount of time that we spend watching TV or reading or doing something like that, rather than practicing the ability to be in touch with the spiritual worlds, it's kind of embarrassing, really. Literally, if we think about it, we have heaven right before us, and we haven't taken the time or the effort to look into it. Now, beginning tomorrow morning, we will have about 5 or 6 talks on the subject of spiritual exercises. We'll talk about safe practices, sound practices, culturally relevant practices, and we'll get into that in itself. Now, our condition here in this chemical region of the physical world has often been likened to being enslaved and imprisoned. We are slaves of our personal desires. We're slaves of our habits. We're limited by our selfish thoughts, and so on. We are imprisoned in our bodies. But there are degrees and kinds of imprisonment. Most of our imprisonment is like solitary confinement. We're in this little cell, and there's light so we can see things, but this light, as beautiful as it is dim. And the confines of our personal existence are close. This is, of course, speaking relatively to the spiritual worlds. Plato, who was an initiate seer, described our case as though through what is called the allegory of the cave. He described people as being in a cave, something like this, and the people are chained down against the wall like this. And the sun shines, and it shines in on the wall, and there may be people outside walking by, and the prisoners in the cave see the shadows. And Plato said this is like what our existence here is. We see only shadows. We see only the light as it's reflected off of an outer world. He goes on to say how different it could be if we could free ourselves from the change and walk out into the light and see the realities themselves. In some ways, his prison is easier than solitary confinement in that the prisoners at least have light, even if it's reflected light. A window, such as clairvoyance, even sense perception, is a big difference. Do you know that they have done studies of hospitals and people who recover in hospitals that are that have the same limitations that are approximately equal? The only difference that they found in studying all kinds of factors that equaled out over many, many cases is that people were more likely to recover if they had a hospital bed with a window that they could see a tree, that they could see life, and they could see something positive going on. In some ways, his prison was more severe in that the people were chained down. In our case, we can at least move around a little bit. How wonderful it could be if we had the key that we could release ourselves from the prison and actually go out into the world. That's what we're talking about spiritually. However, when we spoke about clairvoyance, we did a little describing. There were several reasons for that. One was my limited experience. The second is that the phenomena beggar our ability or our capacity to describe. Another reason is it's usually vain and purposeless. It's almost as bad as having to go to a slideshow of somebody's trip to hear about somebody else's clairvoyance. The same thing applies to out-of-the-body experiences, only with a greater degree of magnitude. It's just very, very difficult to speak of, and speaking of it is perhaps not a wise thing. Now, before we can really talk about out-of-body experience, it seems prudent to talk about the things that are similar phenomena, but that are confused with out-of-the-body experience. Some of these phenomena are all right, some are troublesome, and some are outright dangerous. So we're going to have plenty of caution as we speak about this. When we spoke about clairvoyance and other inner world experience, we discussed a set of terms, or a term composed of several words, that is common to the phenomenon. It is called the association of consciousness. Simply stated, the association of consciousness means putting our consciousness with, in, around, or at another focus or field of consciousness. Experiencing things as they experience them while not losing our self-consciousness. And if we are deep seers, we can actually see the whole thing going on the way we do in a dream. We can see ourselves seeing the other being We can be the other being, and we can be overseeing it all from the vantage point deep in the spirit. Our different bodies are really different vehicles of consciousness. Each expresses a different grade or flavor of consciousness, but it's all one consciousness. We've been talking in these talks about it's all one stuff. It's called cosmic root stuff. And in one direction, in that one stuff, we call it spirit. In another direction, we call it matter. It's the same stuff carried into inner dimensions that science speaks of when it says that so many vibrations. It is the X-ray field, and it's so many vibrations. It's infrared or ultraviolet, and then there's the visual spectrum. But one can follow that much further than science is capable of going into inner realms. So it's all one stuff, and it's all one consciousness. Each of us is a waking focus of consciousness. When we are here, our lives are extended moments of physical consciousness. If we crash into things, or if we caress them, it's a way of sharing and experiencing physical consciousness. But those are crude sharings, and they're highly subjective, because the nature of the chemical region of the physical world and the relative lack of physical evolution of our physical bodies, wonderful as they are, have many limits. We're still developing. Rosicrucian mystics claim that in the same way that touch has proliferated all over our body, that some days, sometime in the future, our eyes and our hearing will also be total over our entire body, be able to see every direction at the same time. We have to have a much bigger consciousness to handle that. Anyway, because of the nature of the inner worlds, the ethers, the desire world, or whatever, we can, if we learn how to do it, associate our consciousness with another being and experience its thoughts and desires just as they do. And if at the same time we have insight, intuitive insight, which is a direct spiritual knowing, and it gets associated with that clairvoyant experience, then one has spiritual vision. One sees and one knows. Spiritual vision even applies to the material world. When we can see what is there and intuitively know what it means, then we have spiritual vision of the material world. Now, association of consciousness isn't always of such a degree that it means clairvoyance. Take mind reading, for example, which is really a mild form of etheric experience. It's an association of consciousness that's not so deep as fully awakened etheric perception. It's more like induction. Etheric perception is always mind reading. It's always available. Now, in the inner worlds, matter, shape, and form are not as important as they are in this realm. Matter and form are subsidiary to life, with life being the most predominant activity. The properties of forms doesn't make any difference whether they're denser. Because this is so, the properties of our inner bodies are such that we can do things with them that are quite remarkable. One can stretch one's desire body enormous distances in space. And if we can focus our attention on that of our desire body that is focused distantly in space, we have basically a sense center that goes for miles and miles. Even that's a small term. If you want an image, think of an elephant's tusk. Only put an eye at the end of the elephant's tusk and stretch it hundreds or thousands of miles. And this is what you're calling traveling clairvoyance, what some people call it. Some people call it astral extension, and some people actually call it astral projection. We're not talking about leaving the body, but it just as well seems as though you are out of the body. Or they could have a new name for it now. They call it remote viewing in some places. Well, that has a lot of negative connotations, but I don't want to get into all of that. But literally, you can extend part of your inner being to where you want to go, and you can see what is going on in that place, and you can gather facts and then check it out later if you want. Now, it's still not like leaving the body. You're still in prison, but you've got a window with some remarkable properties. Now we have to start getting to some of the darker and heavier things, some of the unpleasant things. But before we do that, let's look at a few things so that we can keep them in mind and not be bothered. Since we are anchored and insulated in our dense physical bodies, we are protected. We're protected from inner world agencies, provided we don't make ourselves passive, or provided we don't become combative with inner world agencies. So we're safe and sound in our bodies, provided we don't become passive and provided we don't fight. Either extreme of those attitudes leaves us open. Anytime we have a natural aura around ourselves of love, and anytime that we can, at need, focus on love, such as in prayer, we are automatically protected. Now, it's surprising. The reason this is said, because it's surprising how negative people can become about things. I have seen people that are normally very kindly and spiritually aspiring things, but because they identify with a positive philosophy, they feel that they can sneer at negative phenomena. I think it's very ugly looks on their face. It's something that we have to be very much aware of, that if people are participating in dangerous and destructive and otherwise negative phenomena, they still are our fellow human beings, and they still need our love, and we dare not get negative about their negativity, or we're sucked into the same kind of thing. There is a way of thinking among some people that feel that they rise by putting other people down. And that's the kind of thing that happens when you're looking at other people's negativity. It's always wise to remember that in the long run and in the big picture, everyone is coming to light. And the vast, vast majority of the cosmos is brilliantly light. The little darkness that there is will be passing into light forever and ever. So we're talking about temporary conditions of humanity in our fallen state that have gotten us into all of this. Now, these talks were originally designed to help people form prayer groups for healing and to reduce suffering for people, unnecessary suffering. We're also in these talks to learn something so that we can improve by them, and so that we can help what's going on in the world with greater efficiency. But our intents and our actions are not the only intents and actions that are in the world. There are some beings that have gotten it backwards. They are not only selfish and unhelpful, they are destructive and malicious, and they try to find their divinity in inverted counter-evolutionary deeds. Now, not all of these beings are criminals, and they don't all live really nasty lives in their personal lives. Funny thing is that they study the same things we study, and many of their practices are the same as ours. The only thing that is different are their intents and their ends. Now, not all of these beings are human beings. They vary all the way from dark elementals through humans to almost godlike demonic beings. Now, among people that are this way, they're not usually open. It's to their advantage to be closed, so you might not know who you're dealing with. And even among people, not all of them are profound magicians. Some of them are just plain nasty folks that have learned a trick or two. Now, we've discussed the life cycle, and it is a factor in this as in everything. We learned when we looked at the life cycle that when a person dies, they aren't a different person. They just have to unwind what they have done during life. So there are people who are nasty in this world, and when they find themselves out of the body, they're still nasty. This is one of the reasons why Rosicrucian Christian mysticism opposes capital punishment. Because if you have somebody who is very malignant, and if you take them out with capital punishment, in the first place, capital punishment is totally anti-Christian. Because in Christianity, you believe that anything can be redeemed. With capital punishment, you're saying you can't be redeemed. And what capital punishment turns out to be is social vengeance. If you don't think that the people on death row don't know that, you've got another guess coming. They know that society and self-righteous people in society are being vengeful through capital punishment. So what often happens, if you have a really nasty person and society is being vengeful to them, they'll be vengeful to society. So with capital punishments, a person finds themselves out of the body and vengeful, and they know where they can find weak people. A case in point is Sirhan Sirhan. Remember the guy who killed Bobby Kennedy? He said when they interviewed him or when they questioned him, he said all kinds of beings were telling him that he was supposed to do this, that this was his divine thing. So somebody got out of the body and they found somebody weak like him and took out Bobby Kennedy. That's not the way it usually goes. The way it usually goes is there is a direct relationship between capital punishment and mass murders. Indiscriminate killings of numbers of people, because that is against society at large. As if saying like, all right, you did this to me, I'm going to get back at you. And mass murders, if you follow it in the papers, You can see with the rise of capital punishment, so do the mass murders go up. Sometimes these individuals don't promote mass murder. They attract themselves involuntary sensitives to carry out their ends, even if those ends are just mischief or sometimes misguided assistance. Well, since we're beginning to develop a background into the mysteries, I'm assuming that everybody's been here for all of the talks, we can begin to look at subjects like this by examining them from a number of points of view. The repetition is always good because when one sees things from various points of view, one sees different sides of the truth. And when there's a lot of repetition, it builds one's etheric body so that it is organized into waves. So let's take up this whole study from another point of view. A few talks ago, we spent quite a bit of time on the cycle of consciousness, which is central to all of our work. It's central to every level, every facet of everything that we do. We noted that there were two phases to this cycle of consciousness. Let's start with the spirit. A spiritual focus, a thinker, a self, that's what we really are, gets a creative impulse, which comes from an even higher spiritual realm, and out of that creative impulse, it gets an idea, or it puts together an idea. Some of the ideas are already existing, and it just puts them together in a creative way. Then, according to the will and the skill of the thinker precipitates a concrete thought. This is done by the practice of concentrated thinking. We're concentrating any time we're thinking, and some of it happens with facility because we have a lot of practice from past lives. If we're doing new thinking, or if we're going deeper, it requires much more and much deeper concentrated thought. If the will behind the thought is strong enough, and if the clarity of the thought is sufficient, and it is in accordance with the intent of the thinker, the thought gets projected into the desire world, where it expresses emotion, and it becomes a motive force. Then, if the will of the thinker that has produced the thought and the desire is strong enough to overcome the distractions of the desire world, and if action is called for, that thought is projected even deeper into the realm of the ethers, where it becomes a vital form. It becomes an energetic form. And if there is enough oomph behind it, and it is what is called for, the action is precipitated into the physical world, and the thinker is then a doer and a final experiencer. That completes the extroverted half of the cycle. And at the introverted phase of the cycle, everything is analogous on the same planes going the other direction. Now, in the precipitating of a thought to becoming an external experience, there are a lot of things that can dilute that thought, or distract it, or divert it. And it requires great strength to be able to do that. No matter what the degree of our creative talent, it is extremely important psychologically And it is extremely important spiritually to follow through on what we do. If we want to have spiritual health, we follow through on what we carry out. I'm in a dilemma right now myself. I have retired, and I still have a college degree that I never finished. And I don't know what is the more valuable thing to do with my life, because I want to follow through on what I do, and it bothers me, and I'll have to come to it at some time. Because I can't stand up here and talk about follow through if I'm not following through myself. On the other hand, I don't want to spend several years on a college degree which is meaningless to me. When the creative impulse has spent all of its energy in accomplishing what it was intending to do, or when it is exhausted in trying to do so, that's when the second phase begins. A memory of the form and outer experience is impressed on the ethers by perception and by the breath record, and then the etheric image is carried back into the desire body, and we get an emotional impression. We get a feeling of what the outer world is like. Even if we cut our finger, the finger is where the cut is, and it's carried through the nerves into the etheric brain, and then it goes into the desire body, and the desire body is where we really feel the pain, because it's keenly sensitive, and it's meant to be the pain sensor. Eventually, the emotional impression is re-emoted, and that removes the covering of it, and it becomes a thought. It is remembered. We rethink it, and we rebuild it back into the spiritual idea, which is now more alive, because previously it was theoretical, and now it is actual. Now, this cycle is an analogous form of experience for everyone, from God and the gods and humans and every self-conscious being. Some examples of this cycle take millions of years. Some take fractions of a second. If you're driving down the highway and you're having to adjust and judge, I came down the mountains yesterday, and it was a matter of learning to adjust to each of those curves, and realizing it or not, being self-conscious, that process, that cycle was happening many times per second. The introverted phase is just as important in paying close attention to memory and getting everything out of it. Creative impulses carried out and redeemed as completely as possible result in spiritual satisfaction, in psychospiritual health. The placing and replacing of attention at the various steps and stages of opportunity is another form of dissociation of consciousness. We're just associating it at different levels of our being. Sometimes we experience something and we look at something outside of us, and then the impression happens in our desire body, and we're so repulsed in our desire body at what we're seeing that we sometimes stop down the whole cycle, and we become preoccupied with the feeling of repulsion, which almost paralyzes us in that. So this whole cycle can be slowed down, or it can be stopped. And one can dissociate from the process. And the attention can be displaced. The extreme displacement of attention, or an extreme displacement of attention, is death. It is a long-term dissociation from the physical world. However, for some people, they don't want that displacement to take place. And some people are so bound up in the material world that they will do anything to avoid that displacement. Oh, we're going along fine. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean only nasty people. A good example was given by Emanuel Swedenborg, who, when he was out of the body working as an invisible helper, comes along this woman who's sitting in a little cottage, and it's got a lovely white picket fence and flowers and all of that, and she's not letting go. She's not going through her purgatorial existence because she had the dream of always wanting this little cottage with a picket fence, and she could see it so clearly in her mind that she wanted that when she found herself out of the body, that dream could be manifest in a way that she sensed it. And Swedenborg came up to her in the inner world and he said, you know, you've got other work to do. And she didn't know. She couldn't know. He was a stranger to her. And he said, you know, you're dead. And she laughed at his being dead, at his saying she was dead. But I'm not dead. I've got my cottage and I've got everything the way I've always wanted it. And Swedenborg said to her, for a second, imagine something else is here. And she did, and it all dissolved. And he tried to help brace her. He said, now you've got other work that you've got to do. Now because people want to stay at the earth, now she's not a nasty or malicious person. She's just somebody that got stuck in a dream. Some people are stuck here because they feel unfulfilled. Everybody knows that with ghosts, it happens that very frequently ghosts stay here until they can communicate to someone the fact that they were unrighteously slain or something of that nature, and then they're let go. In most of the cases that we're talking of, this is not the case. The motivation may be vengeance, it may be power, it may be delusion, and it may even be amusement. Some people, when they are displaced from the physical body, do everything they can to stay here. And they are called earthbound spirits or earthbound entities. Now, some of them can be quite formidable in power and knowledge. And they know they have the advantage of being invisible. Many of them learn how to acquire etheric energy through various means. Some of them even store up energy in objects while they're alive so that they'll be able to draw on it later. Some of it happens, they draw off energy when people are emotionally open and, so to speak, open their auras. So by getting people angry, or getting people in sexual releases, or things like that, there are enormous releases of energies at those times. And they know that, and they can excite those activities and be right there to draw up and vampirize that energy as it's released. Some of the energy comes from blood totems. We'll talk a little bit about that in a bit, but it's a heavy scene. Earthbound entities try to gain access to the outer world through vulnerable sensitives. Again, they have various motivations. Some of them even try to be helpful, but most of them are mischievous and such. Is this getting too long, too boring? Too cold out there, huh? Oh, I should have come in earlier this morning and turned the heaters on. Now, we've been making statements here that have quite a few charged values about them. I'm trying to not have personal opinions about it. I'm trying to do everything on spiritual principles. Our bodies are not just convenient, useful objects that we can use them interchangeably like we use suits of clothing. Our bodies are direct experiences, are direct expressions of the creative spirit. they represent us. We, the spirits, manifest bodies that are expressions of us according to all of our creative experience. So they're not just utile forms. In fact, for every existence that we live on, there is a form of government. In spirit, it is altruistic democracy. Because in spirit, we are all part of the universal spirit, and we are one, and we are equal. That means each of us in spirit is democratically equal to the Almighty. The Almighty will never step on our toes and will always respect the divinity in our being. However, we're not equal to the Almighty in manifest expression. And in manifest expression, it is a meritocracy who has evolved longer and who has developed soul power and creative abilities has a greater kind of responsibility in the creation. So it's not quite an aristocracy, but a meritocracy. But in body, the government form is monarchy. Only the being who has emanated the bodies that being has a right to be in those bodies. Spiritual reality is much different from our materialistic misconception of it. Spiritual reality is the reality. In spiritual things, it isn't like here. Here we think the ends justify the means. In spiritual reality, spirit and form, or spirit and matter, are at one nearly. They're coincident. So in spiritual things, the ends are found within the means. It is a continual and ongoing creative activity, and the ends are part of every action within it. Now it's time to speak about mediumship. In mediumship, a medium allows a disincarnate entity to take over the body to some degree. Before we go into the mechanics, let's look a little bit at the ethics. We've just said it is not appropriate for any being to take over the body of another, because it's always to the detriment of the owner of that body. No one is truly uplifted by the detriment of others. The vital body, and hence the physical body of a medium, is significantly exhausted. And a great deal has to be done to repair it. Especially the nervous system suffers greatly. Moreover, mediums are often left with a need to keep themselves alive in the world. And the mediumship isn't there all the time. It's at the beck and call of the control. So the medium sometimes has to do all kinds of unethical things in order to stay alive. The big thing is that the medium is retrograding by not asserting will. Any time that we live in that kind of passivity and something else is directing us or pushing us, any time that occurs, we're being weakened. When these warnings are heard, the medium will often have something to say, but this great being has something to do that is so important that this is an exceptional case. This is a means of flattering the medium. And it's another the end justifies the means argument, in which if you look at it from the viewpoint of the control, it's the opposite of spiritual escapism. It's a kind of material escapism. Let me escape into the material world. If that being is truly great and recognizes its humanity, it can come to birth like anybody else did. Coming to birth and living a spiritual life is the best way to impress somebody with your message, because it is our lives that speak much more strongly than our words. Ralph Waldo Emerson said it very accurately when he said, "What you are speaks so loudly I can't hear what you say." He knew it really well. Krishna did it. Buddha did it. Jesus did it. Lao Tzu did it. Muhammad did it. If they can do it, why can't Seth or Ramtha? They don't seem to me to be any more special than Lao Tzu or Buddha. Often you hear the argument, but the material is so important. But if you look at that, that's an argument for materialism. And that isn't valuing the spirit. That's saying it's all right to use a medium as a medium as long as the material that comes out is good. The medium is not developing his or her own will. And besides, that argument isn't true. At least not in my experience. I've read all kinds of material from mediumship and all kinds of material from seers. And what you get from a bona fide seer is much more valuable. I find that almost all the mediumistic material is sing-song and insipid and greatly watered down. Information from mediumship or channeling is not really solid material. I can't just say it's true. Now, there are a lot of terms surrounding mediumistic phenomena, and many of them are unclear and confused. For example, the modern word channel or channeling. Now, I've heard this mean all kinds of things. I've heard it mean just a simple sensitive. I've heard it mean somebody who's insightful. And sometimes I've heard it mean somebody who's thinking. In some cases it's an involuntary clairvoyant. Sometimes it's a medium. I've even heard this. I've heard somebody saying that this man was channeling his higher self. For real, it was a passive of the higher self. I don't know what to think of things like that. Sometimes it's somebody just speculating. Now, the ironic thing, if you look back into the history of the use of the word channel or channeling, do you know what the earliest source is that I've been able to find? The Rosicrucian Healing Service. When they talk about being channels, they of course mean something much different. It's interesting how many conceptions that have started with positive mystery schools have found counterfeits in things that are not exactly good quality. So those are garbage can words. And any time that you run into garbage can words, you have to be careful. They're used for convenience. Sometimes they're a mask. It's like saying, "Hey, bud," instead of learning somebody's name and addressing them for who they are. Because clear language is really an important thing. The same symptoms that apply when we spoke of what is behind involuntary clairvoyance apply to mediums, only at a much deeper level. I won't go back into them because we're running a little slow and this will be extremely long otherwise. obviously the medium or channel who is giving her or his body to a guide or an angel or whatever they call them is not in positive control. We wouldn't give our car to a mechanic that didn't know what he was doing or didn't have control. So why should we trust our bodies, which are all the more sensitive to a being that we can't see, and put ourselves out of control? Just because someone or something is coming from the inner worlds does not necessarily mean it is true. Now, before we go any further with negativity, we've got to take a little breath and make some positive statements so we don't get into darkness and negativity ourselves. Spiritual powers and faculties can be found by developing, attuning, and controlling our own being. Spiritual powers can be attained by unselfishly serving and becoming part of the divine creative work. The real spiritual teachers would be perfectly glad to initiate us into the spiritual worlds if we were ready and if we proved ourselves as unselfish workers in as much as we do right now. Anybody can do it, and eventually we all must do it. But it means work. And funny thing is, good comes out of even these negative activities. Now, sensitivity is a prerequisite to mediumship even more than it is to clairvoyance. We have already looked at involutionary and evolutionary sensitivity and a few other kinds. For a medium, it's almost certainly uncontrolled sensitivity. Sometimes that sensitivity is latent, and the medium is unconscious of the fact that he or she is a medium until that fact is sprung upon the person by a control. But somewhere along the line, somebody had to have developed into such a way that they become the sensitive that can be a medium. And let's look at some of the etiology of that. Sometimes, if we don't live perfectly right and we don't put forth effort, we lose self-respect in ourselves. And sometimes it becomes syndromic, and we develop a negative personality, and we withdraw in ourselves. If we alibi for our failures, if you want to call them failures, and do not respond but with work, but if we continue with alibying, it eventually leads to a consciousness where, in order to justify ourselves so that we don't become nothings, we project the source of the problem without. The boss was unfair to me, and eventually it becomes full-blown conspiracy consciousness. If one continues to lose self-respect and continues with alibis, people will begin to look for magical solutions. Pendulums and all sorts of things like that. Einstein didn't use a pendulum to develop the theory of relativity. But what happens is people look for magical solutions, things that are just going to happen, repsco-depsco, just that quick, and it's all going to be taken care of. And then it settles into the psychology. If the source of my problems is outside of me, conspiracy or my boss or whoever, and it isn't a result of my continuing to work as hard as I can in the spirit and I'm just making mistakes, if the source of the problem is outside, the source of the solution must also be outside. And then a person is greatly withdrawn to the point that they become sensitive, and they believe then that they become something like the spiritual equivalent of a chemistry laboratory. You know, like the forces that are against me and the forces, the solution are work. This is what most people think about medicine. They think a disease comes from outside, and they think that the healing comes from outside, and their body is just a battleground between the doctors and those nasty microbes. And it's the spiritual equivalent of that happens when one is tending toward mediumship. Now, some people actually put themselves in harm's way. They'll play with automatic writing, or they'll play with the Ouija board, or those planchette boards. Some people actually do, for a party game, they'll hold seances. And some people go far enough so that they go to school to become mediums when they are not mediumistic in nature. I mentioned that in one of the other talks, that I've known people that do that, and because they are forcefully trying to make themselves sensitive, in almost every case that I've seen it, people develop tics. They get uncontrolled muscular movements. The fellow who was the president of the spiritualistic, there's an American Church of Spiritualists who is a church of mediumship. The man who was president for our state was a friend of mine. He'd come by the bookstore quite regularly. We wouldn't talk about that subject because, we recognized that he was still a spirit-seeking man. And so much he tried to sit for mediumship that he had a tic that was really an exaggerated tic. And, it just became second nature to him. All right. Let's continue on looking at psychic phenomena again. And let's try to do them compared to positive phenomena and negative phenomena. Let's look at various forms of inner world communication. Most people call it by the term telepathy. Like most phenomena, what is called telepathy can be accomplished several ways. Some ethical, some unethical. The way it's done in the mystery schools is by a principle of sympathetic vibration. You take a tuning fork and set it vibrating, everything that vibrates at a similar level will respond. Similarly, if a person lives at a spiritual level, that individual can vibrate at a certain level and hold thoughts. They may even hold the person in mind to whom they would like to communicate that thought, but they may not project to that person. And the person, if they are attuned and can raise themselves to that level, there is an etheric communication. Direct and clear. The whole idea is that the transmitter broadcasts, and it broadcasts at large. It doesn't send to just one radio, even though one listener may be in mind. Any transmitter can do that. In this case, as in almost all cases of positive spiritual activity, the means are more general than specific. The spirit is universal, and hence it's general. Personalities are specialties. A personality is specific. Usually, it's dangerous to develop a specific trait and not a general trait. I think the best case are idiot savants, best examples. There are people, they have records of them, they were examined by science, of people that you name any date, October 15th, 2021, and by the time you have the date out of your mouth, they can tell you what day of the week it is. And they can do things like that. But they can't be educated in school. And they turn out to be relatively useless people to themselves and to society. That's the perfect case. They're called idiot savants. It's the perfect case of specialization rather than general consciousness. Now, there are people that can do phenomenal mathematics in their mind, and they could, by using powers of 7 and a remainder, they could figure out the date almost as quick as the idiot savant, but they do it as part of a regular, ongoing consciousness. So it's almost always good to develop the universal and the particular, rather than the particular. Another method of telepathy is invasive. In this method, one pictures the receiver and directly projects the thought to the receiver. It isn't difficult to do. If the receiver is in your perception and you can see the etheric vital body, you can do it amazingly easily. This isn't like sign language where somebody can close their eyes and not see the signs. The thoughts come in like suggestions, and they're powerful. And in order to not act on those suggestions, one has to have enough self-knowledge to know that that thought didn't come from me, and has to have the will to not take it, because otherwise somebody can't project. If we are angry with someone and we're fighting with them in our consciousness, and if we picture them and yell at them, we are, whether we know it or not, participating in black magic. Someone's etheric projectiles, if received, can stay in an aura for up to 3.5 years. Now, this is, from here on, it's a journey through all kinds of psychic phenomena, just to bring an awareness of them. There is one special case of that happens because of the fix we've gotten ourselves in. The Bible, when speaking of sexual relationships, says something to the effect of, and the two will be as one flesh. In sexual intercourse, when we give ourselves to each other, we give much more than we expect. Something of the etheric body passes back and forth. With regular sexual intercourse, more and more is exchanged. It's usually a small amount given the total vital body, but a small amount is enough. It's enough so that we change to look more like each other after a while. It doesn't have to be a small amount. The cases, if you ever read Carlos Castaneda, which was some of the things he said makes your hair stand on end, there are people in the world, and they aren't just Carlos Castaneda kinds of brusaros. There are people in the world that are, I don't know how to say it, sexual pirates. And there are people that engage in sexuality and they leave their partners almost dead. And they usually are attracted to each other to see, because there's a much bigger charge of energy. So when those people start saying that there's a great power and that power can be stolen, there's no doubt about it. You can leave a person all but dead, and some people even claim dead. Oh, it's so dark to talk about these things. This is why telepathy is very common among couples. Each knows how the other feels because part of each is in the other. Even in normal relations, it's significant enough so that they can react by hypnotic suggestions. This is why breakups... Am I going on too long for you? Why breakups are often so painful. Because those etheric ties have been broken, but the all of the materials have not gone home yet. And each can feel the other, and each is angry with the other. And it's enormously, going through a breakup, if there's been a long-term sexual involvement, is a painful, painful process. Between sympathetic vibration and direct projection, there is another means to telepathy. There are all kinds of psychic phenomena. Some people consider it ethical. Personally, I myself do not consider it ethical. It is called overshadowing. In overshadowing, one person interpenetrates the aura of the other and inductively puts its thoughts into the other person's aura without the direct connection of projecting a thought in. So it's somewhere in between the two. The claim is, and I believe it, that there is no etheric residue, and therefore it's all right. However, the subject still has no choice about the matter, and if the person is not free, that's such a good thing. The person is not developing a power to reach out on their own, and unless we develop a power to reach out on our own, we're not growing spiritually. Again, it's like other forms of other world knowledge. Unless you can reach out for yourself, you can't test it. Let's take the phenomenon of thought projection one step further. It is part of a very large field of phenomena called suggestion. Television advertising is suggestion. And the ad people know what they're doing, and they know how to do it effectively. Not all forms of suggestion are unethical. It is a matter of intuitively and knowledgeably, but preferably intuitively, learning what is and what isn't. Invasive etheric projection is almost always unethical. It always leaves part of the vital body of the thinker or the projector in the other person. If a person persists in bombarding somebody with thoughts into their aura, they can drive the other person out, at least in part. Usually what they do is drive the hindbrain out, or sometimes the entire head out, and substitute their own etheric stuff. The control then has complete control of the subject. Regardless of what you heard, anything the subject can be made to do anything if the control over many repetitions becomes strong enough and if certain ruses are used. You can tell the subject to kill the straw dummy. That straw dummy is evil. Kill it. Even though it isn't a straw dummy. One doesn't even have to be a clairvoyant to do this. Of course, the phenomenon we're talking about here is hypnotism, which is sort of the younger brother of black magic. From a mystical point of view, there are very few, if any, beneficial uses for hypnotism. In so-called hypnotherapy, where you hear the hypnotist help me quit smoking, what really has happened is the hypnotist has quit smoking. You haven't. You still have to overcome that barrier yourself, and it's going to be all the harder because you weaken your will by letting somebody else take your body over. In terms of will, hypnotism is not pro-evolutionary by any means. Both great psychiatrists, Carl Jung and Sigmund Freud, gave up hypnotism because they saw it as psychic assault. And they were right. Might does not make right on the material world, and it does not make it right on the spiritual plane. Even if it's volitional, if we go to the hypnotist and ask the hypnotist to hypnotize us, it is still not ethical. Think about it. If it's a form of assault, is it still right for a masochist to go to a sadist and say, beat me? It's the same kind of activity. While we're at it, let's discuss auto-hypnosis. Personally, I can't see why anyone would want to entrance themselves. The object of spiritual exercises is to become more conscious, to become more awake, and to experience more of reality and not to put ourselves to sleep. It is, as the Platonist said, light, more light. On the other hand, I do not think autosuggestion or self-hypnosis is unethical. And I do not think it is anti-evolutionary, provided there's no harm to our psychic constitution by doing it. I think that there are appropriate uses for self-suggestion, but one must know clearly what one is doing and how it works and to what end. And you always have to understand the limits. Some remarkable things can be done by autosuggestion, and they're worth doing. But autosuggestion is a black box. Between the time you place the suggestion and the time that it has fruit might be a considerable amount of time, and when it comes out not quite the way you expect it. And then there's a tendency to think that it is miraculous. And if you become over-enthused, you begin to think that there are no limits. It's true that you can do a few more push-ups with suggestion, but you can't make yourself free by suggestion. You can only do that by waking up in the spirit and not going to sleep. We won't go into any more with this. What you can and can't do by suggestion is a big, big study, and we're just doing a very fast, almost like a running survey of psychic phenomena. Mediumship or spiritualism are almost the opposite of hypnotism and other forms of psychic aggression. Instead of being the perpetrator or the asserter and overcoming in mediumship, it is a matter of willless surrender. Surrender is really a good word, I guess. Passivity, probably a better word. In most cases in mediumship, which is deeper than overshadowing, the medium gives over control of the vital and physical bodies. Usually control is taken at the brainstem. It gets control of the voice box. You can see changes in the face, changes in the voice. Usually utilizing the entire body is too much for the controlling spirit. So it goes for the parts that it needs. Control then communicates, sometimes by voice, sometimes by writing. In pedestrian seances, there are communications from the dead or the so-called dead. If you do this, you can go to a seance, and if you have a couple of really good thinkers, and you decide ahead of time what Cousin Bruce was like, and make up a personality called Cousin Bruce, and hold it in your consciousness, sometimes an undiscerning medium or an undiscerning control will pick up Cousin Bruce, even if there is no Cousin Bruce. Psychic phenomena are most interesting. Now, some people actually do make contact with people that they knew and loved. So this is not a completely bad phenomenon. It's bad for the medium, and it may be bad for the person who's perpetrating all kinds of acts through mediumship, but it gives people faith. But for some people, there's never enough proof. And once they've had that experience of having contact with people on the other side, they keep going back and back and back again. Mediumship is almost always bad for the medium. The health is weakened. If it's a materializing medium where they actually take part of the life ether and pull it out of the body, pull it out through the spleen, and then the control can take on various shapes according to its imagination, that leaves the medium, when they get the body back, exhausted. Energy that is supposed to be sustaining your physical body is being spent in acts that take big hunks out of your life. The real reason, or the primary reason that it's bad, is that the medium is not using his or her will. And everybody else is advancing with will while the medium is not. Passivity is not the same thing as Gandhi's nonviolent resistance, non-resistance. That required great love. That's not passivity. We don't need to talk a whole lot. I'm going to have to cut some material here because we're getting awfully long. We're at 90 minutes already. We're about to shift to a new tape here. But you can tell there are people who are supposedly mediums that are channeling Shakespeare, and Shakespeare has bad grammar and a limited vocabulary and is saying all kinds of silly things. In recent decades, though, there's been a whole new kind of mediumship and channeling. It started with the Betty books. In this case, the controls claim to be teachers. Sometimes they even claim they're angels or divinities. And they propound philosophies and teachings. Sometimes the things are abstruse, some are obscure and fanciful, but most of them have little bearing on science or art or other testable and usable things. There's a lot of self-promotion in it. There's something lacking when there is not the creative archetype and the spirit has not that kind of vehicle to move forward. There's always something lacking from the communication. What is also lacking is energy. We left that dangle a few minutes ago. And so most controls have to use some form of etheric vaporization. If they steal the energy from their mediums, they do that sometimes. But if they steal it from the mediums, then they have no medium to work with. So that necessitates some other kind of etheric vaporization. They do all sorts of things, the things I just mentioned before, but the best source for etheric charges is blood. This is why some people like blood offerings that are involved with heavy magic with entities from the other side. I have a friend that is an ethnomusicologist that has been in Santeria cults where hundreds and hundreds of people were going through magic that involved mediumship, and he's seen phenomenal things. And he's been in Africa with a witch doctor that had entities that it allowed to come through it, and those entities demanded blood. And he said, I'm not a clairvoyant. And he said, when they spilled the blood on the totem object, he said you could just see the entities coming in and getting it. And one man from America, and my friends just couldn't believe it, one man from America donated a bull, a huge amount of blood, and by donating that bull, he would get what he wanted for his ambition. and he didn't know what he was getting himself into. But what they want are blood from totem objects. Sometimes they hang around slaughterhouses. However, the ether that comes from humans is one of the best sources possible because it's of a closer vibratory range than our own. So battlefields are places where you find entities that are stealing energy because they need it. They need it to stay here. Now at this point, it's pretty gruesome. And it's always wise to mention psychic self-defense. Primary reason I don't believe in psychic self-defense is because anytime you're thinking defensively, you're thinking negatively. I think it's always good to go forward, and you can go forward with caution. Knowing a few simple things like crossing your hands and crossing your feet so that people can't steal from you is a good thing when you know you're in an environment like where something like that is happening. Or having a prayer that always evokes love in your being, that when you find yourself in a tough situation, focus on that prayer and bring love, and that's much better than trying to defend yourself using this kind of substance or that kind of thing. We're talking about becoming positive, controlled people. Now there are even deeper and more repugnant negative states than mediumship. And they come under the name spirit possession, or sometimes just possession. In these cases, the owner of the body is deposed completely from the body, and the body is taken over by someone else. In some cases, there is cohabitation. The story in the Bible of Legion, where somebody had a number of entities inside, is not fantasy. Some entities want much more than temporary access, which is all they get with mediumship. And so they get somebody to step out of their body, and then they step in. When you say lose your head, and you're saying frightened out of your wits, that kind of thing can happen. Now, without clairvoyance that you can look and see for yourself, it's hard to tell. Suppose somebody has schizophrenic symptoms. Now, that schizophrenia could be because there are two entities in that body. Or it could be that that person has a desire body from a previous incarnation that is coming around and bothering during this incarnation. Or it could be that the person is internally severely divided. And without the clairvoyance, you have to be very, very on your toes to understand what's going on. But you can with clairvoyance, even a little degree of clairvoyance if you know what's going. I have a friend, he's no longer on this plane. He had a small amount of desire world clairvoyance, which he got in a wrong way. He got it through alcohol and drug use until he drank himself to death eventually. He came to me once and he said, I've just seen a man who has no aura. He said, I didn't think it was possible for a man to have no aura. And I told him, what you've just seen is a man who is possessed. Because what happens is, after you die, and you review the pictures first from the physical body, then you review them in the etheric body, and then they get impressed in the physical, and the desire body. And the aura at that point does not take the shape of an Ovid anymore. It takes on the shape of the physical body. So if that enters into somebody else's physical body, there's no aura, but the desire body is hidden inside the physical body. And so if you have clairvoyance and if you're trained to understand, you can understand these things fairly well. Now, let's take a case. It's a famous case. It's very much like mediumship, only it's worse. A man in England suddenly started taking on peculiar habits. He started taking on Oriental habits. He even took on Oriental features. This eventually caused a rupture with his wife, and when it became full-blown, he started writing books. And he claimed to be a High Lama who had these important books to write. He further claimed that the body that he took over as his own belonged to a man who was going to commit suicide anyway. So at the moment that the man was going to commit suicide, he just took over the body. Now, if this was a really high and holy man and understood the preciousness of the short amount of time that we get here in this life, and if he understood the weakness of this man, he would have helped him so that he didn't commit suicide. So immediately, from when you get that, all of this possession of somebody else's body is very, very suspect. Very suspect. What we do in our lives is our spirituality. When it comes down to it, our lives are all we have. And if we live our lives in such a way that is pro-evolutionary and that is positive to the universe, that's all we really have. There are ways that the same information can be received positively. If you actually need to know phenomena of the inner worlds and you can't get enough from clairvoyance, there are places you can get it. There is a book. There's a book that you can get. It's an old book. I'd say it's about 50 years old now. But it was from a woman and her son who were fascinated by things in the inner worlds. And they decided, they both learned Morse code. And they decided that whoever died first would signal the other one through a telegraph. No need, you don't have to do mediumship. You don't have to do any of those things. The book is called Thy Son Liveth. You can get it through interlibrary loans. It's a pretty hard book to get now. But you can find, if you need all kinds of detail about the other world, you can get it. You don't have to have somebody weaken their life in mediumship or anything like that. Above all, it must be stated that spiritual growth can only come by living a life, can only come by building our own character. Because the stuff of our etheric bodies is what we need to be conscious in the inner worlds. To be taken out of our bodies before we have enough soul material that we can be conscious there is like taking a child out of the womb at 4 months. You have to be ready. And so my feeling about it all is living the life and helping and participating has been such a joy to me. It would be nice if full waking spirituality on all of the inner planes came along. But I'm happy this way. I'm happy giving. I'm happy growing. I'm learning more about myself and the world all the time. Now, there are other ways of leaving the body that are not the same as what happens in the mystery schools. In the mystery school, the one does it by a very careful gaining control and lifting out, and it is a claim of being a divine being. You have to face everything of your past. You have to face everything of your future. There are methods where people leave the body. You can get on the net, you can talk to 20, 30, 40 people in the United States that communicate with each other through a web group, and they talk about being out of the body and the things that they do.
I met a man when I was living here. He was out of his body every night. You know what he did? He went to banquets. And he met nice people at banquets and things like that. Did nothing to help the world. And he didn't even educate himself. You know, he had available to himself almost any kind of knowledge he would have wanted. And he chose to go to banquets because he liked celebrating. He liked the festive activity that was there. But it is a different phenomenon if you leave your body, for example, by the methods of Robert Monroe, who wrote Journeys Out of the Body and one or two other books. They have a whole institute learning how to do it. You can do it, but it's not the same thing. It does not put you in touch with the center of the divine in your own being. I think we've said way more than enough. I think it's I think everybody has at least a beginning understanding of what psychic phenomena are about and some of the dangers that are involved with it. It can be a wonderful thing. I think we all have enough information that we can help others and we can share with others without it having to be negative. And I think we give enough hints for things that can be done positively. What we're going to do now, starting tomorrow, is we're going to spend 5 to 7 days talking about spiritual exercises. Spiritual exercises in general, techniques for developing, and then we'll talk about specific exercises and families of exercises and things that, a few hints that are not in the books, but things that you learn along the way. For now, let's close with the Rosicrucian student's prayer. Oh God, peace our lives.